Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it later. Following today's webinar, we'll be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience, so if at any time during our presentation you have a question for either of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question there. And we'll take hopefully 10 minutes or so near the end of today's webinar and go through the audience questions. We also have three polling questions that we'll be asking during today's webinar. So hopefully you guys will take part, make it a little more interactive for you. And let's see, finally today, at the end of today's webinar, we will be doing a drawing for 3 Amazon gift cards worth $50 each. So please stick around and hopefully you'll be one of our 3 lucky winners. Okay, with all that out of the way, we'll go ahead and get started on today's webinar, which is the guide to managing the security of your SaaS and cloud providers. Our speakers today are Dov Goldman, who is Director of Risk and Compliance at Panarrays, and he is being joined by Demi Ben-Ari, who is Vice President, Research and Development and co-founder of Panarrays. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for the introduction.
All right, so Dov, I think you are going to be kicking off the webinar today, so I'm going to put myself on mute and let you get right to it.
Okay, well, just if we can say a couple of words about ourselves and then we'll jump in, we'll start talking about the content that we've prepared. So Demi, want a quick introduction?
Yes, so like introduced, my name is Demi Ben-Ari. I'm one of the co-founders at Panarrays. I'm the technical co-founder, and basically coming from the background of engineering, cloud, security, all of the above, basically speaking a lot about regulations also in the context of handling my business day-to-day at Panarrays. And I would like to also share from our experience of working and managing all of the SaaS platforms and cloud providers that we have engaged with.
And I'm Dov Goldman, Director of Risk Compliance at Panarrays. And my credential in this space is that I've been in it for almost 10 years. So third-party risk and compliance is something I'm very passionate about. And I'm very focused on helping people to share best practices, what has worked for them, what hasn't worked for them. And so I think that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about today. So with that, I'm going to jump in and we'll start going. Demi and I have done a lot of webinars together, and well, we're kind of chatty, so please expect a lot of interaction here. So let me start out by getting you all to visualize a picture. I think of an attack surface, your presence, your vulnerability in cyberspace. I think of it as kind of a big bubble in a mythical space called cyberspace. And as an organization, or as the world of business outsources more and more of its technology functions to other providers, cloud and SaaS and other kinds of technical vendors, that bubble, it grows and grows and grows. So you may have thought of the area you had to defend as being your own perimeter, your networks, your servers, and all of your equipment. And now that's not true anymore, and it's less and less true every year. And as you can see on your screen, your risk is going to grow, and it is growing because you're sharing data with other organizations, and if they're breached, you're breached. Another huge area that attends to this growing attack surface, this bubble in cyberspace that's your risk cloud, so to speak, is the fact that you are subject to more and more privacy regulations. I talk to people every day, and it used to be a few years ago that information security related issues just dominated every conversation. But now privacy compliance, I think, is becoming the #1 topic, and it's because everybody's seeing more and more overlapping regulations from different governments everywhere in the United States and around the world. So the way people have traditionally responded to this challenge of managing that growing bubble reflecting the ecosystem of your vendors and all of your relationships is questionnaires. And they work, and unfortunately, they also have a lot of defects. And most people are using a one-size-fits-all approach because, well, that's the first thing that they think of, and it works well enough, so they keep doing it. But it can be very, very problematic. So there's got to be a better way, and that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's start out, if we can, with a polling question. I'd like to understand in our audience, how many of you are assessing your cloud and SaaS providers using some form of questionnaire?
Yeah, so the polling question should be up on your screen now. So if you could answer either yes or no to the polling question for cloud and SaaS providers that you assess, do you use questionnaires? We'll give you guys a couple seconds here to answer the poll, and then we will take a look at the answers. So while we're waiting, do want to remind the audience that at any time today during the webinar, if you have a question, please, you can use your GoToWebinar control panel to submit the questions. You don't have to wait until the question and answer period. All right, looks like we are just about there. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out now, and we'll take a look at the results. Whoops, hold on. Here we go. Okay, there are the results. Looks like a majority of folks are using questionnaires for you guys.
Yeah,
not surprising.
Indeed, we can see
There
that.
you go.
All right.
Okay.
There you go.
So let's think about what that means. A little over half of the audience are using some form of questionnaire. I imagine some of you are pairing questionnaires with requests for documents, attestations, certifications, and things like that. And that's good. And that approach does help because you get more context. But one of the first problems that I want to highlight with questionnaires is there is no context. So going back to something I said earlier about one size fits all, I don't think you really want to send the exact same questionnaire to every single one of your vendors. You can end up with a very long questionnaire, and it's not going to be directly relevant to the specific business that you're doing with them. You may annoy them, you may slow down a response. And when you're dealing with an approach like this, well, think about that growing bubble that I'm trying to get you to visualize. That involves more and more relationships. That means more and more questionnaires, more and more documents to read. And so you now have a resource problem. And this human intensive approach does not tend to scale. Another issue that we find, and this is something I know that was a very real driver for Demi in founding this company, was that a questionnaire may reveal the security state of your provider on day one, meaning that when you get the questionnaire, they're telling the honest to God truth. Okay, let's just say you know exactly what's going on. Does it let you know what's happening on day 2, day 30, day 60, day 90? And unfortunately, the reality is it doesn't. And so you have to find some other approach. And what happens when you look at a questionnaire or some of the other documentation you've been supplied and you find out there's something you don't like? What do you do? Now, we could do endless polling questions about this, but I imagine there's a lot of telephone calls and emails, and it's not terribly efficient. So let's turn this around. We're talking up until now about funny image, right? We were talking about pets before we started the webinar, so it's very appropriate. But we've been talking about it from your perspective, from the customer's perspective. But the provider is an important part of this collaboration. How do they see this process? And I'm not going to read through all of this. My favorite one is still the dog ate my questionnaire, which is why we had that image before. But there's all kinds of reasons why people will delay filling out a questionnaire. And I'm going to add one other reason, that some people figure out that when they fill out a questionnaire and they send it over email to you, they're essentially sending out a document that they lose control of because it's been sent. And that's a "how do you hack me" map. not necessarily the kind of thing that everybody wants to send out. So there's a lot of reasons why providers don't see questionnaires as such a great vehicle. Demi, any thoughts?
Yes. I highly agree with what you said. Basically, looking on questionnaires and doing, I would like categorize that as a one-off, and maybe it can happen on the onboarding process. Maybe it's some time of like cadence that you're providing basically for the answering the questionnaire. So meaning all of these things are being done manually today, sometimes with Excel spreadsheets, sometimes even like with tedious Word documents. They can go up to like 360 questions, even more. If you know, like the basic SIG-Lite is like 360 questions, okay? SIG-Core, maybe even like more. So basically, even answering these questionnaires on the other receiving end, I would say, of the providers themselves, if it's a cloud service provider, or if it's basically the SaaS platform that we're using, because most of our services are external, this whole process takes so much time, okay, going back and forth with all of the questions and answers, but it doesn't really provide something that is substantial and also like in the context of something that is real, like you've mentioned, okay? So again, even if they are super efficient and pro-efficient also with answering these questionnaires, what happens in day two? So you would say basically, let's eliminate the manual things, right? Okay, and can we automate this? Because probably it will make our lives easier, right? 100%. What do you say about that, Dov?
I think so, but
so
maybe
okay,
maybe not. Let's talk about it.
I don't know, like, is the automation actually the answer for all of our problems? Because I think it's not enough, okay? And from experience of evaluating lots of companies, and also like from the experience of our customers, you need context to that, okay? Because you can't, like you said, it's not one size fits all. You need context. For example, you won't ask a SaaS service provider how he's doing like his physical data center because most of his servers are on the cloud, right? It doesn't make sense. And again, most of the questionnaires there are in the context of physical security, etc. And it's basically Google, okay? And can you actually dispute the physical security of Google? Probably not. And not only in the context of how you're working with a vendor, you need context for the whole interaction, for the whole workflow. And again, doing that continuously. So basically you need visibility on the actual infrastructure and actual, like, I would say, asset list of the vendor itself. So a questionnaire basically won't cover that. And even automating that won't make it so awesome. And of course, you need also like verification from the other end. Like you mentioned, maybe the other practitioner that is getting that on the receiving end of the vendor, maybe they're super like professional in the context of cybersecurity and data privacy. Again, we're talking about data. It's not only the service that they're providing, right? So basically they can provide many excuses on different kinds of things of why do they not comply to certain, I don't know, like aspects of your policy. So we do understand right now that basically automation is not the only answer. This is one of the abilities that you can do to actually leverage this whole like workflow, but it's not enough.
Demi, what is the role of the business sponsor in this whole dance? How do they help or hurt the people who are actually doing this work?
Okay, so let's first of all like define the whole context of business sponsor, what that is, okay? Because we are looking at that as security practitioners, data privacy people, even people in the organizations that are in charge of the process. It can be even somebody from procurement or somebody from legal. Somebody owns the process, but not the person that owns the process a lot of times like starts it, right? Maybe I am the security practitioner working with some kind of process in place in my organization, but the people actually like working with the vendors, I would say like third parties, SaaS platforms, come from the marketing department, okay, or from the procurement department. So eventually you have another entity in your organization, and sometimes you even don't know him personally, that is in charge of the context of how you're working with that third party. And this is actually the business sponsor that is in charge of the interaction itself. He needs to actually input all of the relevant contextual information for you to be able to do your job efficiently and correctly, I would say also. But again, what type of data he can actually provide for you to be able to do your business better as an IT risk pro, okay? I would say, first of all, I want to know which kind of data is involved in that whole process. Again, most of the things that we're handling in the past, you used to talk about like assets of the company. Assets of the company might be IPs, domains, subdomains, but it's not only that, because right now, in the context of working with the cloud service provider, the data is an asset. And right now, when the data leaves my premise, I need to know what's going on, what kind of PII information maybe is involved in that process, okay? How the data flows, data retention, okay? What kind of data you're using for any kind of service, who has the access on the other receiving end, right? Because you have a lot of employees that might be tampering the data. And of course, do they use subcontractors? Because the vendors of my vendors might be somebody that I need to worry about also, okay? Do you agree? Like, think of it that our SaaS platform is using a cloud service provider also, right? It makes sense. Do you know what's going
100%.
on the fourth party? Maybe yes, maybe not. And it's a really, really big problem currently in the market. So we can take some analogies of how you actually gain visibility on that whole process, okay? And the restaurant with the dirty windows and how you do the external facing things and understand how the internal things look if the external looks dirty, okay, for example. And basically you need to do some kind of automation with automatic tools of scanning and also understanding the real security posture of any company. And when I say that, basically think of it in the context of regulations. A lot of times in these like questionnaires you would ask, are there ISO 27001 certified? Do they have a SOC 2 report to show you? How do they comply to data regulations, right? You would ask that, I think. And basically for that, you need some kind of coverage to at least understand all of the controls that are in place and if they are implemented correctly. But Dov, how would you do that?
It's a challenge. But there has to be some kind of a framework in place that enables you to have an independent view of your partner's cybersecurity, what they're doing. And something as you see on the screen here, there has to be some kind of a way of monitoring that as that goes forward. And
exactly, like you mentioned in the beginning, questionnaires and all of the manual processes in place today are one-offs, right? So let's say in the previous assumption that we can automate that whole process. And we can do that on a certain cadence that our policy actually defines. It can be quarterly, it can be annually, okay, right? But let's scope this. You need continuous monitoring in the scope of infrastructure because everything is dynamic and ever changing. And the most important thing is that you need to correlate both views. Also, the internal policies that you can understand from the questionnaires, because this is the way that you do things today, but doing that on a certain cadence. And of course, getting continuous monitoring to verify all of the controls with the external scan. I'll give you an example, okay? Data privacy wise. If you're stating, for example, that you're holding your data encrypted in some manner, and the access to your platform is without HTTPS, this is something that is in breach of policy that you kind of attestate on yourself. And also, basically reviewing the policy on a certain cadence, speaking maybe daily, it might be weekly, it might be quarterly. Really, it depends on the criticality of the vendor and the regulations that you need to comply to. This is the most important thing because this continuous and ever-changing world basically gets some kind of visibility and you understand the landscape of vulnerabilities that you're introduced via your third party.
So you're introducing a concept here of tiering your relationships according to their criticality and their risk, and coming up with some kind of a monitoring regime that is scaled to that. So let's ask our audience a couple of questions in that area. I'll say that over the last 5-6 years that I've been very heavily focused about third-party cybersecurity and privacy, the word monitoring has been thrown about, and I always put it in quotes because it's not clear what people mean by that. What do you mean, audience, by that? What kind of monitoring processes do you have in place?
Okay, the poll should be right up on your screen now. Go ahead and make your choice. What kind of monitoring process do you have in place? You can select from none, repeat views, vendor self-reporting, or scanning. Go ahead and make your selection. And just another quick reminder, if you have a question for either of our panelists, please, you don't have to wait until the question and answer period. You can go ahead and submit your question at any time. Okay, we'll give you guys a couple more seconds here. And then we'll close things out. Oh. Okay. Okay, looks like we are getting what we're getting, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll out now, and we'll take a look at the results.
So interesting that scanning is predominant here. There's a number of answers here that have something. I'm going to kind of ignore the 9% repeat reviews and the 11% none. But 46% are saying that they're using some kind of a scanning, which is, I think that's where it's going, Demi. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but it seems to me that's where it's going. Interesting that people are relying on vendor self-reporting. I will highlight, just going back to the 9% repeat views, one of the things that a lot of the regulators harp on is that you do have to have a cadence of repeat control reviews. And that is certainly an issue with any kind of compliance, that the regulators may not be ready to accept the technology-driven monitoring as the sole way you are checking on a repeated basis as to how your vendors or your outsourcers, your providers are working. So let's move on to how we turn this into something that is a process that is collaborative with your suppliers and in general your third parties, your providers, and not something that's a confrontational type of a process. One of the things that you might want to do is to give context to your suppliers. When you say, I have a problem with your X, it's a lot easier for them to swallow it if you put it in the context of why that is a problem for you, and maybe even why a problem for them. Another thing to do in the questionnaire is to respect the context of the relationship. I'm repeating something that we said earlier, but when a questionnaire is short and is relevant because it's directly in relationship to what you're doing with a provider, it's easier for them to answer. It makes more sense. And then another thing that helps in a very, very big way is when you're hitting them with a list of findings from your scanning solution, make it easy for them to understand how they fix these things, prioritize them for them, and help them understand what to do. And that will make it obviously much, much easier for them. We do have one more polling question here. We would like to follow on what I said just a moment ago here. How do you, or do you, share the findings of whatever tools you're using to assess cybersecurity posture? Are you sharing them with your providers, and how do you share them?
Okay, once again, that poll should be up on your screen, so go ahead and make your selection. How do you share findings with your providers? We don't share findings. We communicate on them via email, or we communicate through a dedicated risk platform. Go ahead and make your selection, and we'll give you guys a couple more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close it out and take a look at those results. Okay, let's see. Oh, they're still coming in, guys. Keep those votes coming. Oh. All right, looks like we are going to be pretty much done at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out, and we'll take a look at those results. Okay.
Debbie, you want to react to what you see?
Yeah. Actually, it makes sense, and we see that over and over again. Basically, having the communication via email is the easiest way, and it probably is one of the longest ways in the context of time, because it's human labor intensive and it takes a lot of time to go back and forth with email. Sometimes it's with different time zones because you're using different providers from different countries, right? And this whole process prolongs and even makes our lives much harder as security practitioners, and specifically speaking also in the data privacy world. And once you don't have that collaboration, or at least when the collaboration becomes hard, it's hard even to try to understand the real posture, because then you don't get straight answers. Sometimes you get, at least if you're not interacting, you're not getting any action and any information. But once you do some kind of interaction and you incorporate the third party in the context of what you're doing, and you show them the same findings, and you are able to speak on a specific platform. So for example, if you're doing it on some kind of dedicated risk platform, it makes your life much easier because you can talk about specific things, and you don't speak like on a single finding and then go back and forth and then move on to the next one. You can keep track on it, okay? And this is a really important thing to make your work much more efficient and cover as many critical vendors that you have, in opposed to, you know, like what I can make in a cadence of a year.
So Demi, that kind of takes us back to something we said earlier about context, that an email is probably out of context. It's not inside of the whole picture for your supplier, and it's not inside of the specifics of what you're talking about. You're just whatever you put in there, and so that's not necessarily the easiest approach. Let's keep on going. We'll talk about more right now. It kind of flows into how do you make this better? How do you build a program around third-party information security? So I would say that the first step here is to identify who plays. You're going to have multiple drivers within an organization. You're going to have what we referred to earlier as the business sponsor. There's going to be some kind of a procurement team. Maybe they even have a vendor management function. Increasingly, that is the case. So you'll be working together with them. Who will set the standards? You know, Demi, I think that with everybody who you're working with, there's somebody who sets the standards. What is acceptable? What do we care about? What are the controls that matter to us? And there has to be a collaboration that makes that real. So once you have those people laid out, you have the teams laid out, there's some form of cooperation that's institutionalized, you then need to come up with a way to define the tiers. You have to triage your provider portfolio. You can't do the same thing for everybody. You'll never have enough resources. You can't put the same level of focus for everybody. So you have to,
even if you had enough resources, why do that? Okay. And again, maybe it imposes some risk, but again, it's the risk factor that is important in my opinion.
Right, 100%. So then you have to define what is your expectation of each tier. What is your security policy for each of those tiers? And it will be very, very different. You will then define what I always call a standard of care for the tier. So we know what security policy is for that tier. That's the goal. That's what we'd like to achieve. And how do we get there? What is the methodology? What controls do we put into focus? How often do we do a repeat review? And then when I manage by exception in between the reviews, I get an alert out of my technology-driven scanning type of monitoring tool. What do I do? Who does it? And how do I accept the risk or ask them to fix it? Now, clearly, management by exception, as I said a moment ago, is very, very important. You really have to focus on who is out of band. Those that are in band, great, move on. They're doing what you want them to do. When you have somebody who's out of band, what do? Do you ask them to remediate? Do they fix it? Or do you stop doing business with them? Or in some cases, do you put in place compensating internal controls? These are ways that you can protect yourselves and still continue the relationship with that provider who may not be capable of actually remediating. So let's talk about what this program actually looks like in operation. I've kind of defined how you start it, some of the preparatory work, the documentation. Well, once you're actually doing it, here's what it looks like. You start out with each vendor or provider, third party. You do analysis. So you first are going to peg them to a tier. You're going to define what the industry calls the inherent risk profile, write out. What are you doing with each of them? Are you sharing data? Are you sharing personal data? Are they processing credit cards for you? Are they actually contacting your customer? Are they providing a cloud service? Are they developing software? And then you're going to assess them, and you're going to use probably a combination of questionnaires and document reviews and other scanning tools to get a full picture. And then you're going to engage with them. You're going to communicate with them, let them see, this is our view of how it should work. Full disclosure, tell them everything. Let them understand why it's a problem for you, and attempt to get them to remediate. And in some cases, vendors won't respond. If you're asking Microsoft to respond to a questionnaire, or you're trying to scan Microsoft, these are a waste of time. Demi, I think reality is that there's no real value to scanning Google Cloud. Tell me if you disagree with that.
Let me ask you, what do you try to achieve with scanning Google Cloud? Okay, Google Cloud has so many, Google or Microsoft or whatever, they have so many services. What kind of tool you're interacting with? Who is the person, or like even department, I would say a sub company at Microsoft or at Google that you're trying to access, and what that actually means. So we're not talking about like the really massive mammoth.
So isn't the real answer for vendors at that end of the spectrum, the huge whales that dominate the cloud business, to put the right controls in place on your side, how you set up your AWS bundles,
Exactly.
what you do to set the security, what data you put into that bucket there is a big part of what you can control. You can control things like least privileged access and so on and so forth.
They actually have a name for it.
Yeah.
It's called shared responsibility, and it's in a contract with every cloud service provider today. This is something that they say, we provide you the means to actually do security, but the responsibility is shared among both of us. Okay, how you're handling that security is on you. And the context here is really, really important when you're using that provider.
So there's another end to this spectrum here, which is the smaller, less sophisticated providers, where they might be willing to answer a questionnaire. They may not really understand the questionnaire, and they really don't necessarily have a very sophisticated cybersecurity capability. And in that case, it's also about compensating controls, understanding what you can share with them and what you can't share with them. And therefore, I don't know if they're the responsibility to share. The responsibility may really be on you, not to share data with them that you don't want to see broadcast all around, and to give them what the industry calls least privileged access. If you want to avoid getting breached through them, well, let their account be very, very limited. After you've done this, and whether it's a matter of remediating or on your end implementing compensating controls, you need some kind of an approval process, some kind of a risk assessment, risk acceptance, and or not. Say, no, we cannot work with this provider because they're just not getting up to our standards, and there doesn't appear to be a path for them to do it. So now you've approved them, or not. If you have, what happens from day one on, day 2, day 30, day 60, day 90, some kind of monitoring and a way of sharing that information internally. And one of the things that I've seen as a very, very big lack in programs like this is, well, it's hard to understand the value of it. People get that cybersecurity is important. They may not understand the executive management of an organization, the board of directors may not understand why it's worth investing in third-party cybersecurity. It's important to show what you're doing, to have the reporting and presentation tools that explain the value of what you're doing to the business sponsors, to the procurement people, to the C-suite, and to the board of directors, so they understand you are really protecting the front door, the back door, the side door, the top and the bottom, because your business really runs inside of this broad supplier community, broad provider community. So let's summarize this. Demi, if you can, give us an example that last point that I made about selling your program internally. Can you talk to us about somebody who has done that, who has
Yeah.
succeeded at doing this?
Yeah. So I highly agree with the selling point, but think of it, who are the people that you actually need to present these kind of things? Because the buyers, I would call them, inside the organization, basically might be the board of directors, but it's also your colleagues. Okay, things like people that collaborate with you in that whole like workflow, right? We talked about the business owners, we talked about the whole workflow, engaging with the vendors, etc. So you have other entities in your organization that basically need the assistance of the practitioner that is handling that workflow internally. So first of all, I won't even say about budget and effort that you need to invest. I will like focus that in somebody having the responsibility, and it's basically having the responsibility of the data and the security posture of the company. And once we spoke about the perimeter, once the data actually left the premises and went to the SaaS provider, cloud service provider, etc., they actually became a part of our perimeter. So eventually, every entity in the organization that is engaging with that like SaaS provider will be a part of our process. So how do you do that in a large scale? For example, let's take one use case that we actually handled with an insurance company. Okay, they had I think 1,500 vendors in general. Also like SaaS providers, cloud service providers, marketing tools, lots of like different interconnected applications that they had. So like you mentioned, you need to prioritize, right? You need to classify your vendors. So eventually we helped them out with the initial mapping of the vendors themselves, and they wanted to assess 200 providers. 200 sounds substantial, right? When you want to put a program in place, it takes time. So they actually built some kind of program for, I think it was like around, they planned it for 10 months to actually implement and onboard all the providers to the platform and start working with some kind of workflow. So basically, they wanted to provide kind of like reports to the board of directors. And this was the responsibility of the CISO itself. He was in charge of data security and also like physical security in the organization. It really depends on the type of organization that you're working with, the things that fall under his responsibility. So he needed to do lots of things in the context of cybersecurity and data privacy. Okay, he needed to understand at least like who are the critical vendors and do some kind of cadence of security audits and data privacy audits on them. What was the actual risk that came out of it? Because sometimes it's an interconnected application, but you don't give away any PII. So you need to classify them accordingly. And you mentioned the tiering mechanisms that we have in place. And of course, improvement. Okay, let's say that somebody says that I don't know, a really large provider is not okay with security, but I do want to actually work with him. So sometimes I need to maybe increase his security and engage with the vendor and try to understand at least how we can improve his security posture. Or maybe I can put some compensating controls in place, right? For example, if I understand that I have an on-prem solution working, I won't go for like the cloud service providers, but I have some kind of like company that provides maybe I don't know, an on-prem solution, and they don't have encryption. Maybe I can put physical security measurements in place to protect and kind of mitigate that risk, right? So all sorts of implementation manners for different kind of controls can actually do help us do business, I would say. And of course, I would like to also like mention the budget thing, okay? Because right now, if I have a substantial amount of vendors that I need to assess, and I need more resources to actually do that, maybe on-site audits, pen testing, etc., a process in place can actually like introduce the way for me as the security practitioner to show the board that I need more resources. If it's money, if it's people, if it's maybe an external subcontractor that will be managing part of that process, because I can't do on-site audits and I need that. And this is another resource that I can use when I have some kind of program in place and I've built that accordingly, that I will be able to actually do that really easily. And right now, maybe I want to also like correlate. I did an on-site audit, I did penetration test I need to correlate that information, I need something that actually helps me to do that. Because right now I'm looking on external facing things, internal policies, more further into depth tests, and maybe I need to understand how I correlate that into a whole big picture to show the board the real risk that is imposed by my third party. I think it covers most of the workflow that we did with that specific use case, and trying to understand at least the cyber posture of your business partner on a continuous manner is really, really important when you're trying to assess the real risk on your data. Because again, the data actually defines the scope and our real perimeter today, and it's not only on-prem, it's on our cloud service providers and SaaS providers also.
David, you want to summarize, now that we've been talking about the general ideas of how we advocate on a best practices level what to do, want to talk about what we do at PanArrays?
Yep. So I would mention more of the process because I think I can talk for hours, days, and maybe months about technology, and I'd rather not bore anybody right now. But you do need to look on both ends of what we actually spoke when we kind of try to define some kind of process. So external scans, we all kind of agreed that external scans make our life easier, scalable, etc. Okay, so generally speaking, the outside-in approach, looking like a hacker would look at a company, is really important. Understanding the attack surface, understanding the real asset mapping of a company, and then afterwards trying to correlate the vulnerability landscape that we see from the outside. Okay, and this is like being done automatically, and of course in a scalable manner will make our lives much easier. And as the complementary part, I would say, you need to understand also like internal policy of the company according to your own policy. So one size fits all questionnaires doesn't work, but contextual things like we mentioned, this is the way to actually go. And once you have that in place, even the collaborator from the other end would be really, really happy to actually talk to you and try to understand how to improve himself, because he really does want to do business with you. Okay, eventually you are doing business. This is the whole like context of it. We need security on our data to be able to provide the assistance to our business. And once you have the correlation of both, you need to have the process in place. First of all, we've analyzed the information gathered from the outside automatically, and also from the inside according to my own policy, right? So we've talked about the analysis phase. This is the first phase that actually the PanArrays platform provides really easily in a scalable manner, basically on all of your third parties. You can mention different tiers, etc. So all covered in a workflow inside the platform on a single one-stop shop. The next phase would be actual engagement with the vendors, right? Because we spoke about kind of having them the ability to view and kind of assess the findings that we found, right? And then we go to the next step, the engagement with the vendor itself. Bob, can you click in the presentation?
Does this, I don't even remember if, oh, there we go. Yes, the slide does have animation.
Yes. Animations are awesome. So eventually, you need to engage with the vendors to kind of get the interaction, get verification on the controls, right? And how do you do that? Basically invite them to the platform and have everything engaged inside the platform. Collaboration on the questionnaires themselves, maybe even providing some information about the findings, maybe disputing things, because you do have false positives. Because of the dynamic world that we live in today, sometimes you do have some things that are found that you might have some kind of dispute. Even in pen testing, you do scoping, you try to kind of explain that some assets are not in your control and you can't actually do anything with that. And maybe you even decide as an evaluator decide that this is not important, okay? This is something that I can skip because it doesn't really impose risk according to the context that I have with the vendor. So having that like whole engagement part actually refines that data. And the data set that I have is purified and I can understand a single source of truth, which is pretty, I think, correct, because I have the interaction of the vendor. And you remember the excuses that the vendor has? This is something that is kind of getting eliminated once you have the collaboration, because you do have practical things that are in place with automatic scans, with the correlation of the internal policies themselves. And then we can move to the next phase of the engagement part, I would say, with actual remediation, because we can decide on a plan together, or at least a roadmap, because nothing is instant. Okay, they need time. They need that sometimes, like maybe other assistance from other entities to kind of remediate all the flaws that we kind of together might have found, right? So that whole interaction and the mitigation gaps can be provided via the platform. We can do other kind of managed services, maybe other people helping out with improving the IT infrastructure, or maybe even like doing security training. Okay, how do you like respond to new employees joining the company, etc. So you basically need to do some kind of training to explain how the infrastructure and the workflows in the organization work. So these all are remediation actions that can be put in place. But of course, after we've remediated things, we need to approve that, okay? Because right now we need to verify. We spoke that maybe we've fixed some, I don't know, like encryption issues that we've had, maybe some physical things that were open to the outer world that didn't need to be open. So basically you need also to verify and kind of understand if all of the things that were put in place, the controls that were put in place, are really remediated, because maybe they actually said that they do something, but they still haven't fixed it in the correct manner. Once we've done that, this is only one way of actually finishing a cycle. But the continuous monitoring part is one of the most important things. And when I say continuous, it's really ambiguous, because a lot of times people say continuous is annually. Annually is a cadence. You need to do the continuous monitoring according to the policy that you have in place. The cadence is actually a derivative out of it. Because if we have like critical vendors, I would like to also have that specifically mentioned in the workflow itself to be monitored 24/7 in the outside-in approach. And also maybe the cadence should be higher, specifically doing that on monthly basis, because again, things are changing. So I think we've covered the whole workflow. And again, I talked about one cycle. This should be ongoing and going and going on the day-to-day basis.
So Demi, I'm going to summarize real quick, if I can, that what we have is a very, very pretty UI with a user experience that, and I know because I've been involved with other products in the past, people who've known me for a long time, I've shown them our product and they're, wow, that's really nice looking and really obvious. A pretty UI that helps you to categorize your vendors, that's the context, to send a questionnaire that's smart, that reflects that context, that happens through a secure web portal, that's easy to answer, that remembers their answers. If it's a repeat, it's a cadence and you're coming back, or they answered something similar for somebody else on our platform. And then to bring that together with the scanning all into a single rating, and to use the terms of the industry, we're talking about inherent risk. We're defining the inherent risk of the relationship. We call it business impact in the product. We're identifying the strength of their controls through the questionnaires and through the attack surface scanning, and we are generating a residual risk rating. And then we're giving them ways to manage the remediation, the interaction necessary with the vendor to make sure you get everything done, and when something goes wrong, alerts. So it's all together, and it's very pretty. I can't emphasize that enough, and it's very, very easy to use. So with that, I think, Charlene, should we turn it over to the audience to see if people have questions that have come up?
I saw some questions,
Yeah, we've gotten some questions in so far, but there's time. If you have a question for either Dov or Demi, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll get to as many as we can. Let's start with this one. When you say that we, the customer, need to share responsibility for securing the data, how? We will only access that SaaS provider and upload or download our data. So what should we as clients do?
So I think I'm going to take part of this and hand it over to Demi to fill it in. But going back to this idea of context and of segmenting your population, some providers are going to require some particular sets of controls and others are going to require others. So let's set aside for a second your massive cloud service providers, the infrastructure providers like Google Cloud, where, well, that's where the responsibility is really shared, where you've got to do a lot of work. If you're working with a SaaS provider that you're handing them data, they're processing, they're doing that behind the screen of their equipment, their systems, or their cloud provider more likely today. So now you really need to assess them. You need to look at what they're doing and where they are deficient and not capable of providing better controls because they're just not sophisticated enough. Then you need to limit the data that you share with them. And that's one of the tools that I've seen in very professional third-party security programs where companies are excited about innovative partners that may be smaller, not as mature, and they figure out what can we actually share with them, and they may carve things out and test how good they are when they can't report on their cybersecurity controls. Demi, I don't know if you want to add or refine.
Yeah, I'm actually like adding another legal aspect to it because like I'm doing a lot of DPO work specifically with our legal team, and this is the main issue when you're signing a data processing amendment with a third party. It might be somebody really substantial, but when you're taking the data, the document itself from him, or like you're kind of agreeing on something with him, this is the scope of the data that you're sharing. Okay, so eventually, when you understand and you can scope the data, you can also scope the risk. So in that context, data privacy in the context of what you're trying to share, uploading and downloading data is kind of like general. I would like scope that to specific details that I'm sharing and then understand if it actually imposes risk on me. And if not, maybe everything is okay. Okay, it doesn't really matter if they have a lot of security flaws because they don't impose a lot of risk on me. But vice versa, it might be really a substantial thing and I maybe need to disengage or even like do further action to kind of improve the interaction that I have with the vendor, like you mentioned, putting different kinds of security controls in place for that to be more secure.
Or in some cases, you can work out agreements with vendors so that the data persists in their systems for only as long as need be.
Yeah, data retention.
And then it's not retained. And that's a tool that I've seen used very well, very effectively by sophisticated third-party security managers in many places. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I see here. You want to take it? Or like,
Sure. The question is, my company is global and most of the providers are in Brazil and may not speak English. Do you guys support Latin America?
So yes, basically we've actually localized the platform to different languages. We actually have the platform localized to Japanese also. Again, mostly because of these reasons. Sometimes you have different vendors in different countries and you need to engage with multiple layers of questionnaires. Again, mostly also like providing them the ability to see their own posture and understand at least the text of what mitigation actions are needed to be taken. So because of that, we had to do that in the platform itself. So inherently, we do support multilingual things. Even if we don't have a specific language in place, we can pretty easily like put one in place and move forward. We had in Russia, in different parts in Europe also. So you have multiple languages.
Excellent.
The data that you get back is always returned to you in English. So if you have somebody who's answering a question in Chinese or in Portuguese, you will be able to assess the results in English. And any other questions?
Yes. Looks like we have 2 or 3 more here. So we'll just keep rolling along here. How do you monitor the provider?
Demi, you want to take that?
Yep. Okay. So basically monitoring is in the hacker's point of view. We basically do 24/7 monitoring on 3 pieces, I would say, of the subcategories. We look on the IT and infrastructure, all of the layer 3 of networking and below, looking on SSL certificates, physical IP addresses, botnets, etc. Looking on the higher level application layer, which means web-facing applications, domain-targeted attacks, mail servers, etc., and also the human factor. So we're kind of like scoping the whole aspect, the 360-degree view on a company. And once we do the collection part on an ongoing basis, basically we can provide the changes on the infrastructure itself. So we also like continue and kind of update the attack surface of any organization being looked from the outside. And of course, with correlation with vulnerability databases, we provide absolute scoring to these vendors, these providers. And this is being done on a 24/7 basis. And even the cadence itself with the inside out approach, this is also something that is being provided to the platform according to the policy of our customers.
Excellent. So Demi, we're just to make sure that it's clear to everybody that what we are doing will take into account when a provider changes their infrastructure. So did they put a server online where they left the vendor default settings in place and ports are open or something like that? We will detect new assets. We will scan all the existing assets and the new assets. So you're always going to have an up-to-date asset list, and you will see the latest findings. You will see what has changed. Any other questions?
Looks like we have one more. Did you have something else, Dov, or Demi? Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I want to continue with the next question.
Oh, okay. All right. Sure.
Of the scans themselves. The question is, the provider might not actually agree to be scanned or monitored by any company. Okay, right. So the thing is that the external scans, this is the most important thing, they are non-intrusive. Okay, this is something that we take from the public domain, publicly available information, automatic scans that are being done on open source intelligence and regular web traffic. So by only that, we can understand a lot about the exposed infrastructure of an organization. For example, if they had exposed the database to the world, this is a big no-no. Okay, so by that, we don't need any consent to that because we're not doing anything malicious or anything like intrusive to the perimeter of the company. You would say also, okay, so if you're doing that externally, how many things you can actually like explore and understand? So the answer for that is a lot. You can see a lot of negligence basically in the context of providers exposing things that are not supposed to be out in the open, but also understanding the internal policies and incorporating the vendors to collaborate in the platform. This is something also strong because then they are a part of the ecosystem. And once you talk to them on the platform itself, it's much easier to do the whole workflow that we actually put in place or try to put in place here with some practices to building a program yourself. I really hope that it actually like answers the whole workflow of scanning and all the questions about like the engagement with the vendors.
Great.
We have time for one more question.
One more question. Yes, let's see. Are there good sources of questionnaires content to start with?
Yes.
Do you want to take it?
So, yes, I do. So I'm quite passionate about this. I don't think the time that you would invest in building your own questionnaire, I don't think it's a great investment because there are other people who do this professionally who reflect a tremendous amount of research into regulations, the latest cybersecurity standards. So I would point you in the direction of two organizations that are nonprofits that have the best content out there. There's the Cloud Security Alliance has a questionnaire they call the CAIQ, very highly regarded, and Shared Assessments has the SIG, Standard Information Gathering Questionnaire, which has been in existence and evolving for somewhere between 10 and 15 years and reflects a very large community of members, their priorities and their interests in terms of compliance and risk. And so you can start with either of those and you will automatically have good coverage of the critical controls that experts have determined you need to focus on. And these questionnaires are mapped to the most important standards in NIST, ISO, multiple versions of NIST, regulations, GDPR, HIPAA, industry standards like PCI DSS. That's kind of work is very, very hard for you to do in such a thorough way. Leverage what other people have done. Don't recreate the wheel. All
right, great. Well, we're a minute to the top of the hour, so we do need to close out the question and answer period. Do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. Lots of really, really good ones. Also want to remind the audience real quick that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of today's event, you will have the opportunity to listen to it later. We are going to be sending out an email a little bit later on today that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be on the Security Boulevard website, so you can always go there, find it. Just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. And also before we go, I did promise you a drawing for 3 Amazon gift cards, so I'll do that real quick. Our winners who will be contacted via email after today's webinar are Andy S., Elena R., and Nicole B. We didn't use the last names for privacy reasons, but congratulations to all 3 of you. Dov, Demi, thank you so much for your time. Great presentation.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all of the audience joining, and have a great day.
Yes, thank you to the audience for attending today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.